A man in the front row stood up and screamed a racial slur at Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy's voice cut off mid-note. The microphone trembled in his hand, and 500 people in the room held their breath. Listen, because what Dean Martin did before security arrived silenced that man. But afterward, no one dared look Dean in the eyes. The Starlight Room at the Golden Sands Hotel wasn't the biggest showroom in Vegas, but it had something the bigger rooms didn't. When you sat in the front row at the Starlight, you could see the sweat on a performer's collar, catch the glance they threw to the band when a note landed wrong, hear the breath they took before a high note. It was March 1963, and the Rat Pack had been selling out the room for 6 nights straight. Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., the holy trinity of cool. Every seat was taken. Every table had champagne. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and the kind of laughter that only comes when people feel like they're part of something exclusive. Sammy had just stepped into his solo. Dean and Frank had moved to the side of the stage, letting him take center. The spotlight narrowed on Sammy's face, and he started singing The Birth of the Blues. Slow, smooth voice curling around every word like smoke. The room leaned in. This was the moment people came for. Sammy wasn't just a performer. He was proof that talent could break through anything, that a man could stand on a Vegas stage in a tuxedo and make 500 strangers forget everything but the sound of his voice. The band was barely audible behind him, just a whisper of piano and brushes on a snare drum. Sammy's eyes were closed. He was somewhere else, somewhere safe. Then the man stood up. He was in the third row, just off-center. A white man in a black suit, broad shoulders, red face. His table had 3 empty champagne bottles on it. His friends, 2 other men in dark suits, looked uncomfortable, like they'd been trying to get him to sit down for the past 10 minutes. But he didn't sit. He stood. And he pointed at Sammy, and he screamed. The word he used doesn't need to be repeated here. You know the word. It's the word that's been used to strip dignity from black men since this country was founded. It's the word that was still legal to say in public in 1963. It's the word that Sammy Davis Jr. had heard 1,000 times before, but never on a stage where he was supposed to be untouchable. Sammy's voice stopped. Not like he forgot the words, not like he ran out of breath. It stopped the way a car stops when it hits a wall. His mouth stayed open for a second. The microphone still an inch from his lips, but no sound came out. His eyes opened. They found the man. The man was still pointing, still screaming. The same word, louder now, turning to the people at the tables next to him, like he was rallying them, like he was trying to show them something. Like Sammy was an exhibit. The band kept playing for 2 more bars before the piano player looked up and saw what was happening and let his hands fall silent. The drummer stopped. The bass player stopped. The room was silent, except for the man's voice and the low hum of the air conditioning and someone's glass clinking against a table as they set it down too hard. Dean Martin was 10 feet away from Sammy, stage right, standing in the shadows just outside the spotlight. He'd been holding a drink, ginger ale in a rocks glass, the same prop he carried through every show so the audience thought it was whiskey. He wasn't smiling anymore. Frank Sinatra was on the other side of the stage, frozen mid-step, one hand halfway to his pocket. His face had gone pale. Not shock, rage, but he didn't move. Not yet, because in moments like this, there's always a split second where everyone's waiting to see if it's real, if it's actually happening, if someone's really going to let this stand. Notice how Dean's eyes didn't move to the man. They stayed on Sammy, watching, calculating, because Dean had seen this before. Not here, not on a stage, but he'd seen what it did to Sammy. He'd seen the way Sammy's shoulders would drop after a show when someone in the lobby refused to shake his hand. He'd seen the way Sammy laughed a little too loud at jokes that weren't funny, the way he worked twice as hard as anyone else, just to be considered half as good. Dean knew what that word cost, and he knew Sammy was about to shatter. The man screamed again. Same word. He was enjoying this now. You could see it in the way he swayed on his feet, the way his mouth twisted into a grin. His friends weren't laughing. One of them had his head down, staring at the tablecloth. The other was looking toward the exit, like he wanted to disappear. But the man kept going. He turned to the woman at the table next to him, an older woman in pearls and a fur coat, and pointed at Sammy again, like he was saying, "Can you believe they let him on the stage?" Sammy still hadn't moved. The microphone was shaking now. You could see it in the way the light caught the chrome, the way the cable swayed. His face was frozen in something between shock and shame, and if you'd been sitting close enough, you would have seen his eyes starting to water, not crying. Not yet, but close. Security hadn't moved. The Starlight Room had 2 security guards, both stationed near the back exits. One of them had started walking toward the front, but he was slow, cautious, like he wasn't sure if this was something he was supposed to handle or something management would want him to ignore. It was 1963. Vegas was a place where certain things were tolerated if the man doing them had enough money. This man looked like he had money. His suit was tailored. His watch caught the light, and he was drunk enough to be dangerous, but not drunk enough to be harmless. 30 seconds had passed since the first slur. Maybe 40. It felt like an hour. The room was holding its breath. Some people were staring at the man. Some were staring at Sammy. A few were looking at their drinks, trying to pretend this wasn't happening. A woman 2 tables over had her hand over her mouth. A man in the back row had half stood, like he was thinking about doing something, but his wife pulled him back down. Dean set his glass on the edge of the stage. He didn't slam it, didn't make a show of it, just set it down, slow and deliberate, the way you'd set down a tool before you started a job you knew was going to be hard. Then he stepped forward, out of the shadows, into the light. Frank saw the movement and looked over, eyes wide, like he was about to say something. But Dean didn't look at him. He was already moving toward the front of the stage. Stop for a second and picture the room from above. The stage is elevated, maybe 3 feet off the floor. Sammy's in the center, frozen. Frank's on the left, tense as a coiled spring. Dean's walking toward the edge, his steps slow and measured, like he's counting them. The man is in the 3rd row, still standing, still pointing. His friends are sinking into their chairs. The security guard is still 20 feet away, moving through the tables like he's walking through water. And the rest of the room, 500 people, is watching this play out like it's a scene in a movie they didn't pay to see. Dean reached the edge of the stage and stopped. He looked down at the man. The man looked up at Dean. For a second, neither of them moved. The man's grin faltered, just a little, just enough to show he wasn't as confident as he wanted everyone to believe. Dean's face was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that makes your stomach tighten because you know it's covering something else. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He just looked. And in that look, the man saw something that made him take a half step back. Then Dean stepped off the stage. Wait, because this is the part almost no one talks about. Dean Martin didn't jump, didn't leap. He stepped down, 1 foot after the other, like he was stepping off a curb. His shoes hit the carpet between the stage and the front row with barely a sound. He straightened his tuxedo jacket, adjusted his bow tie. Then he walked toward the man's table. 3 steps, 4. The man was still standing, but his arm had dropped. The pointing finger was gone. His mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. Dean stopped 2 feet from the table. The man's friends were staring at their laps now, like if they didn't make eye contact, this wouldn't be happening to them. The man swayed, tried to puff out his chest, tried to look like he wasn't scared, but his eyes gave him away. They flicked to the side, looking for the exits, looking for security, looking for anyone who might step in and save him from whatever was about to happen. Dean leaned in. Not far. Just enough. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout. What he said quietly. So quietly that only the man and maybe his two friends could hear it. The rest of the room saw Dean's lips move, saw the man's face go white, saw the man's knees buckle just a little, like someone had cut a string holding him up. 10 seconds. That's how long Dean spoke. 10 seconds of words no one else heard. Then Dean straightened up, took a step back, and waited. The man sat down, fast, like his legs had given out. He didn't look at Dean, didn't look at Sammy. He stared at the table, at the empty champagne bottles, at nothing. His hands were shaking. One of his friends whispered something to him, but the man didn't respond. He just sat there, silent, small, like he'd been erased. Dean turned and walked back to the stage. The security guard had finally reached the front row, but Dean waved him off with a small gesture, a flick of the wrist that said, "It's handled." The guard stopped, confused, looking between Dean and the man, and the stage manager hovering near the wings. No one knew what to do. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how Vegas worked. Dean climbed back onto the stage. He walked over to Sammy, who was still standing in the spotlight, still holding the microphone, still frozen. Dean put a hand on Sammy's shoulder, squeezed once, gentle. Then he looked out at the room and said, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Let's take it from the top. Band, give the man his intro." The piano player looked at the drummer. The drummer looked at the bass player. No one moved. Then Frank Sinatra stepped forward, clapped his hands twice, and said, "You heard the man, from the top." The band started playing. The same song, same tempo, same intro. Sammy blinked, looked at Dean. Dean nodded, just once. Sammy took a breath, a shaky breath, the kind you take when you're trying not to fall apart. Then he started singing. His voice cracked on the first word. Not badly, just enough to show he was human. But by the second line, it was steady again, stronger. And by the time he hit the chorus, it was the same voice that had stopped the room cold 3 minutes earlier. The same voice that made people believe in something bigger than themselves. The man in the third row didn't look up, didn't move. He sat there for the rest of the song, then stood up during the applause and walked out, his two friends trailing behind him. No one stopped them. No one said a word. Remember this. The rest of the show went on like nothing had happened. Dean and Frank traded jokes. Sammy danced. The audience laughed and clapped and ordered more drinks. But if you'd been watching closely, you would have seen the difference. The way Dean's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The way Sammy kept his gaze on the back of the room, never the front rows. The way Frank kept glancing at Dean like he was checking to make sure he was still there, still solid, still Dean. Backstage, after the final curtain, after the applause had died, and the lights had come up, and the crowd had filed out into the casino, Sammy found Dean in the hallway outside the dressing rooms. Frank had already gone ahead, laughing with a couple of showgirls, pretending tonight was like every other night, but Sammy stopped. He looked at Dean. Dean looked back. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Sammy said, "What'd you tell him?" Dean shrugged, pulled a cigarette from his jacket pocket, lit it, took a long drag, blew the smoke toward the ceiling. "Doesn't matter. It matters to me." Dean looked at him, really looked at him, and for a second, Sammy saw something in Dean's eyes that he'd never seen before. Not anger, not pity, something colder, something that lived in the space between protection and violence, the space where a man decides how far he's willing to go for someone he loves. "I told him," Dean said quietly, "that if he opened his mouth again, I'd make sure he never walked out of this building. And I told him I knew people who'd make sure no one ever found him." Sammy stared. "You don't know people like that." Dean smiled, a small, tired smile. "He doesn't know that." Sammy laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes when you don't know what else to do. When the only other option is crying, and you've already done that too many times. He shook his head. You shouldn't have done that. Yeah, well. Dean took another drag. I did. You could have gotten in trouble. Real trouble. What if he'd gone to the press? What if he's not going to the press? Dean's voice was flat. Final. Guys like that don't go to the press. They go home and tell themselves a story about how they stood up to the big bad entertainer and got thrown out of the room. They don't tell people they sat down because someone whispered in their ear. Sammy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." Dean nodded, stubbed out the cigarette on the wall. "Don't mention it." "No, really. Thank you." Dean looked at him again, and this time his eyes softened, just a little. "You're my friend, Sammy. That's what friends do." They stood there in the hallway, two men in tuxedos, surrounded by the muffled sounds of slot machines and laughter and the endless hum of Vegas at night. Then Frank's voice echoed from down the hall. "You two gonna stand there all night, or are we getting a drink?" And the moment broke. Sammy smiled, Dean smiled, and they walked toward the noise, toward the light, toward whatever came next. But here's the part no one talks about. The part that didn't make it into the stories people told later. The part that didn't show up in the gossip columns or the Rat Pack documentaries. The cost. Listen to what no one noticed. After that night, Dean Martin never performed at the Starlight Room again. The Golden Sands offered him double his rate for the next run. He turned it down. No explanation, just a polite letter from his manager saying Mr. Martin had other commitments. The Starlight Room closed 6 months later. Not because of Dean. Not officially. But the owners knew. The performers knew. When you cross a certain line in Vegas, when you let something happen on your stage that shouldn't have happened, the word gets around, and the best acts start taking their business elsewhere. Dean didn't talk about that night. Not in interviews. Not with Frank. Not even with Sammy. After that conversation in the hallway, it became one of those things that lived in the space between them, unspoken but understood. A scar that didn't show but never quite healed. Years later, a journalist asked Dean about the Rat Pack, about the Vegas years, about what it was like to be on top of the world, and Dean gave his usual answer. Smooth, funny, deflecting. But at the end, the journalist asked, "Was there ever a night that stood out? A night you'd do differently?" Dean was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the journalist thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "There was one night, guy got out of line. We handled it." He paused, "But I wish we'd handled it sooner, before it got to Sammy. Before he had to hear it." "What would you have done differently?" Dean smiled. That tired smile. "I would have seen it coming." The interview moved on. The journalist didn't ask for details. Dean didn't offer them. And the story stayed buried, the way most real stories do, under layers of legend and myth, and the polished version people prefer to remember. But if you talk to the musicians who were there that night, the ones still alive, the ones who remember, they'll tell you the same thing. They'll tell you that after Dean stepped off that stage, after he walked up to that man and said whatever he said, the room changed. The air changed. It wasn't just that the man sat down. It was that everyone else, every person in that room, understood something they hadn't understood before. That Dean Martin wasn't just a smooth-talking crooner with a drink in his hand and a joke on his lips. He was a man who would step into the fire for the people he loved, and he'd do it without hesitation, without applause, without asking for anything in return. Sammy knew it. Frank knew it. And after that night, Vegas knew it too. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. And if you want to know what happened the night Frank Sinatra had to choose between his career and his conscience, tell me in the comments. Some stories are worth remembering. Some silences are worth breaking.